Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in 5 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to begin. Please welcome Mirabella Broquet-Elbaz, Global Head of Brand and Marketing at Semafor.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's session at Semafor's 2025 World Economy Summit, Securing Our Future. It's so wonderful to have you all with us today, and I hope you all enjoyed a lovely lunch or wonderful meetings today, and thank you for making the time to join us across these 3 days of programming at the World Economy Summit. I'm Mirabella Broquet-Elbaz, Global Head of Brand and Marketing here at Semafor. For those of you who may be less familiar, Semafor was built nearly 3 years ago to help leaders find clarity in an increasingly interconnected and complex world, one that is shaped by polarization and really doing so with our fair-minded, independent journalism. We now have amassed nearly 1 million subscriptions worldwide, and the world's leadership is increasingly turning to Semafor's journalism for our sophisticated and balanced news and insights. And the World Economy Summit is our platform dedicated to advancing the dialogues that we believe are most critical. Those that are really focused on strengthening resilience and catalyzing global growth during these kind of times of massive shifts within our global economy. And we did not quite imagine that the summit's timing would take place during such a consequential time in our global economy. We're obviously gathered here in Washington, D.C. At a moment of extraordinary uncertainty and extraordinary transformation in the global economy and in the world order. It's a moment that demands clarity, leadership, wisdom, and dialogue across sectors, borders, and ideologies. And this afternoon's program is going to delve into the rapid technological breakthroughs that are kind of intersecting with a very fast, increasingly complex geopolitical landscape, ultimately kind of reshaping the ways that governments and businesses operate. And navigating this terrain is going to require not just resilience and agility, but a forward-looking mindset, one that embraces the opportunities that are emerging from advances in AI, from cybersecurity and beyond, to build a more secure future for the world. Throughout this session, we're going to explore these issues through incisive conversations with global thought leaders, with top government leaders, and with global CEOs. And to kick us off, please join me in welcoming German Finance Minister Joerg Kukies in conversation with Semafor's business and finance editor, Liz Hoffman.
Mr. Minister, thank you for coming. You've come a long way.
Thank you for the invitation.
So who knows what it'll look like by the time we get off stage. But on the trade talks, is Europe in a rush? Is the U.S.'s hand here getting stronger or weaker as this drags on?
I wouldn't say that there is a rush, but we do see a sense of urgency to find an agreement because, as we saw, we are announcing a new data set of growth, which won't be great. The IMF is announcing a reduction of the growth numbers. So in that sense, like the urgency to act is definitely there. And I think the one of the things that every CEO that I speak with tells me is it's all about reducing uncertainty at some point, because at the moment, while nobody knows whether there will be a deal, what the deal will entail, investment decisions are being procrastinated, consumers are procrastinating consumption decisions. So at the end, from that perspective, it's bad for everyone.
So there's a Polish official, I think 2 weeks ago, said, the U.S. just lost $5 trillion. Like, we'll just wait and see how this goes. But you're saying that even though it might be that you could get a better deal in a couple of weeks, that the economic picture will have gotten significantly worse.
Well, first of all, we don't know that.
Yeah.
And second of all, the longer we wait for an agreement, the longer we let the uncertainty in both of our economies linger. And I just don't see that as a positive.
Okay. I think were in Washington just before the tariffs were announced.
Yes. Well, I was in Washington. I landed literally when the auto tariffs were just announced, which was a few days before the reciprocals were announced. So I was sandwiched in the middle.
Perfect. Autos are what % of the German industrial economy? But did you, in talking to administration officials, did you get a sense that they were going to do what they did? Like, what do you think they were trying to accomplish?
It was very clear that the window to talk about what would be announced on the 2nd of April was closed. So that was very clear that there wasn't a willingness to sort of rethink the ideas around the 2nd of April. But everyone also said that there would be this phase of engagement and willingness to negotiate, and I took with me the clear message to Berlin and Brussels that we should take seriously on the one side what would be announced, but on the other side also the clear signal that exactly what's happening now, namely a phase where there is room for negotiation, would come up.
And how much of the negotiation is going to happen at what's the Brussels versus Berlin? Brussels to Berlin to Paris to, how is that going to happen?
Brussels.
Okay.
The European Union is completely clear.
You have requests and you send them off?
It's one of the very few policy areas that's completely delegated authority. Brussels is speaking on our behalf, and the endorsement procedure afterwards is such that, as in the United States, many international agreements then have to get ratified, and it's the same way in Europe, where the European Union negotiates and then the member states have to agree to it. But the whole negotiation is being done at the European level.
So how do you make sure that German autos are right up there with French champagne, and as these sort of one-off requests get mandated and people figure out what goes in and what comes out, how do you make sure that you're in line?
I think we're not that different between the US and Europe in that sense, because as everyone in the United States knows, there's specificities of what gets produced in California and Minnesota and Kentucky and everywhere else. So, like the fact that there's regional interests that get voiced and that get escalated to the government, I think that's just the most normal thing on earth. And I actually don't think there's a huge discrepancy there between the United States and Europe in this sense, because we have in Europe delegated the authority, and of course it's the Commission's job to get awareness of which industries have which interests and how is everything connected with not only the United States, but also the read across to Canada and Mexico, because of course a lot of our automotive value add and our chemicals and pharmaceuticals, et cetera, also gets created through global value chains that don't only run, like straight line Germany to the United States. Very often things move first to Mexico and then to the United States, or in other channels.
The Bundesbank, Central Bank of Germany, owns a lot of treasury bonds. I realize it's not quite your remit, but what do you think of, has the U.S. become a riskier borrower, a less creditworthy player over the last couple of weeks?
I absolutely don't think so. I mean, of course, markets are reassessing things constantly around what bond yields characterize, but I don't have the impression that there's any reassessment of credit risk. I mean, the United States is the global reserve currency and will probably remain so for a very long period of time. Europe has to get its act together in terms of creating a capital markets union to create more depth and more liquidity in our own benchmark bonds. Germany contributes to that. But I think when we saw this adjustment to the announcement, yes, it was quite strong and it was volatile, but it was all orderly and very much, just the pricing in of new information, which is what markets are supposed to do.
I want to talk about Europe, and just like one more on tariffs, because Angela Merkel, when she was promoting her book last year, I think, said that Donald Trump had told her repeatedly that there were too many German cars in New York, and that if we're up to him, he would tariff them out of the market entirely. So, and I think there's a couple of, I think one of Audi's bestsellers is now essentially unsellable, just from an economic point of view in the U.S. What's your advice to CEOs of Audi and Volkswagen as they think about trying to maintain access to the market?
I can tell you a personal anecdote. My wife drives an American car.
What does she drive?
A BMW.
Okay.
Made... And it's
free trade at work.
And
yeah.
it works because it's a BMW made in Spartanburg, South Carolina, right? And it's true, and it's I'm not making this up. I just spoke with the Minister of Finance from the state of Baden-Württemberg, which is the home of Mercedes, and his new official car is also an American car built in Chattanooga by Mercedes, right? So this global value chain, I mean, BMW is the biggest exporter of cars by value of the United States of America. So in that sense, you know, like this whole intricacy of the value chains show that there really isn't such a thing as a pure American, pure German. There's a few exceptions, of course, but the large OEMs from Germany are all very big players in the United States.
You think there'd be a way to get a cheaper BMW made in Germany, or like they wouldn't have to make that round trip?
Well, but I think that's one of the ideas that, you know, like, and a lot of the automotive makers produce centralized certain types of cars in certain specialized factories, and then they distribute them to the world. So the fact that the large German car makers build some of their cars in Germany, some of them in the United States, some of them in Mexico, some of them in China is a perfectly normal economies of scale kind of thinking in business terms. And of course, tariffs distract from that, and tariffs make this whole system less efficient. And probably at the end of the day, if we overdo it, make us less competitive versus China rather than more competitive.
In terms of making Europe more competitive, you know, when I talk to CEOs, what they say is, well, you can launch a product in one country, but you can't scale it. You come to the U.S. and you can have 300 million consumers, and you run into a boundary, you run into a border, you run into a currency problem. How do you make the investment community think that you are serious about fixing this time?
Well, first of all, by nature, of course, the European market is less uniform than the American market because of the fact that there's many languages spoken and many specificities of the markets are different. We are a less unified political entity than the United States, and also culturally, we're also a bit more diverse. But that is, you know, like that's normal. What we have to urgently change, and what is subject to political agreement, is that we can and will need to deepen our common market for goods, which is already quite well integrated. For services, it's horribly integrated. So the integration in the financial sector, capital markets union, is not very good in terms of insolvency law. We have 27 insolvency laws, which makes scaling financial products much more difficult, consumer products much more difficult, for legal services. For many of these things, there's just no unified European market. And that's something the Draghi report, the Letter report, the Commission's strategy, the competitiveness compass, all say the same thing. We just now have to get into doing instead of always talking about it.
Would this have happened without Donald Trump?
Well, the whole discussion around European competitiveness predates the election in the United States.
But the Draghi report, it came out, everyone said, that's nice, and it didn't feel like it had a lot of momentum around it.
I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, there were already a lot of discussions around, and, you know, like it was mandated 2 years ago. So this whole discussion around the fact that around 2.5 decades ago, the European Union and the United States were at the same GDP level. Now the United States is about 45–50% higher, depending on how you currency adjust, than Europe. I mean, that phenomenon and that problem has been discussed in Europe for quite a long time. Of course, now this whole impulse on we now have to really urgently fix our problems, it has become stronger, but it's not only a Trump phenomenon. I mean, you know, Germany has been overly dependent on Russia for energy, on the United States for security, and on China for exports and imports. And so our problem, our fundamental structural problems are not only associated with the United States, they're also associated with the fact that we've over-relied on building stuff in Germany and exporting it to China. We've been over-reliant on importing energy from Russia and not diversifying enough. So we have more issues in our structural problems of our economy than only the issues that Trump addresses.
So Germany is borrowing a lot of money. It's It's going to do a major infrastructure investment, defense spending investment. It's a country that has been pretty frugal for a long time, does not carry a lot of government debt, doesn't do a lot of stimulative things. And in fact, we had your predecessor, Christian Lindner, was here last year, and I asked him about this, and he made fun of the Inflation Reduction Act, said it doesn't work, why would we do it? It doesn't work here, Germany doesn't need it. Germany's about to have a really big stimulative industrial policy. So what's the plan? How comfortable are you that you can actually invest in the right things?
So first of all, I wouldn't completely agree with your frugality assessment. I mean, Germany has always been disciplined on fiscal in the good times, but if you remember, when Corona happened, we announced a massive spending plan to stabilize our economy. We were even criticized for doing too much and unleveling the playing field within Europe because we put too much of a fiscal impulse to protect our businesses. When the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, we made a massive fiscal impulse to assure our energy security and to revamp our energy pipelines and infrastructure within 6 months. So in that sense, and that required a huge amount of fiscal spending. So I would say we've always been sort of the classic, in the good times, reduce deficits, build buffers, but in bad times, and we've had those examples, we have been willing and able to spend a lot of money to fix problems. And that's where we are at right now.
This is a bad time.
This is a bad time because we are seeing that one of the three dependencies that we created is now coming to a big culmination point. Namely, the United States is now very serious in saying we will demand Europe to do its own thing on defense. The first wave, by the way, already came as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Germany, after Russia invaded Ukraine, in fact only 3 days afterwards, announced a constitutional change that would allow us to go to 2% NATO target, which we had neglected to do, to be fair, for 8 years since the NATO agreement in 2014 to 22. We fell short on that, but we fixed it within the last 3 years, and we are now at 2%. So we are fully in compliance with all of the international agreements that we have. But of course, we see now that the world is changing and that Europe will have to do a lot more than just meeting the NATO target of 2%. Namely, we will have to be able to build the European pillar of NATO to be so strong that it can make a much bigger contribution. So that will require a massive fiscal effort. Some estimates of our constitutional change mean that we will be raising about €1 trillion of debt in the next 10, 12 years roundabout. So that is about 20%, 25%, depending on which reference year you use, of our GDP. So it's a very substantial amount.
Is Germany culturally comfortable remilitarizing? Do you have that muscle?
Yes. I mean, Germany, remember, up until the turn of the centuries, was already at 3.5% of GDP spent for defense. So this is not a new phenomenon to us that there is a threat from Russia. It used to be the threat from the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall separated our country, and there was a strong willingness to defend against that threat. And so, in that sense, there is never a sense that we can relax. There was this period where the hope that we could extract a peace dividend was probably overweighted, but that's something that is now being fixed.
And remind me how big the non-defense portion of the spending that you're doing is?
Yes, so that's very simple. It's a 500 billion notional special fund that will be reserved and exempted from our debt fiscal rules that will be spent over the coming 12 to 15 years. So 12-year projects have to be filed and approved, and then they will be built in the remainder. So somewhere between 12 and 15 years, that money will be spent in roads, in bridges, in railroads, in ports, in 5G networks, in 6G networks, in digitalization, in health infrastructure. So it'll be a pretty broad definition of infrastructure.
Okay.
And the one thing that I have to add to that is we will not stop at the fiscal side. The one thing that we also have to fix is our lack of structural growth. So apart from the fiscal reform, we also need fundamental economic reform in the labor markets, in the energy markets, in reducing red tape, increasing planning and speed to market, in digitizing our offerings. So in a lot of those non-fiscal areas, we also need a very substantial growth impulse to increase our potential growth.
Is the economy over-indexed to heavy industry, pharmaceuticals? You have a lot of automakers, a lot of big capital-intensive things. Where's the tech come from? Do you even need that?
Well, I mean, I would say SAP is now Europe's largest company by market cap. Siemens is a massive tech company in Germany. If you look at our famous Mittelstand, there's a huge amount of tech companies in there. So in that sense, I would not agree with the fact that we are sort of what you insinuate a little bit, that we're more old economy than new economy. So there is a very good mix. But of course, the fact that we've been underinvested in the digital, the fact that we are traditionally a very debt finance-based economy rather than an equity-based economy has something to do with our pension system not being very reliant on equity returns and 401k type of saving for your own retirement, but rather a pay-as-you-go retirement system where there's no capital accumulation. We are changing that. Just to give you an example, every 6-year-old child will receive a 10 euros per month incentive to build up their old age retirement plan. So that will be paid to them between the age of 6 and 18, because we just think from a fundamental mentality shift, we have to think about a new generation that will grow up just getting used to investing in equity markets and seeing and associating that with a positive building up of a capital stock.
So are these the venture capitalists of 2030 and 2040?
Who knows?
Because if you look at the list of startups, the big startups in the world, I mean, the numbers in Europe versus the numbers in the U.S. are stunning.
Yep.
Stunning. How do you get some more unicorns coming out of the continent?
Well, I think the fundamental difference between Germany and the United States is, I mean, I saw that when I went to university in Boston and Chicago, is people are already thinking of their retirement plans in forms of ETFs and 401ks and all of the things that are equity-based. In Germany, that is simply not the case. So the accumulation, and if you look at where the Sequoias and the Andreessen Horowitz get their money from, it's a lot of pension funds that invest there and then they deploy the money into startups. And this transmission chain just simply doesn't exist to the degree in Germany as it does in the United States. But it's not even a United States versus Germany thing. I mean, Sweden has a much more deep pensions market based on equities. Denmark has one. The Netherlands has one. Australia managed within a decade to build one. And that's the thing that Germany needs to do.
Though I think, too, if you look at the big tech startup success stories that have come out of those places, Spotify, Adyen, I think they're basically all listed in America. They're all listed in New York.
Yes.
But there's a point at which the capital markets in Europe can't sustain. It's hard to start startups, hard to scale them, and then when they get big, they go somewhere else. How do you
So
do that?
I asked the founders of a company called BioNTech, which became famous because it invented the vaccine against corona, which was founded by two professors in my hometown called Mainz near Frankfurt. When I asked them, why did you IPO in New York and not in Germany, they basically said the fund volume of biotech investors in Boston exceeds the fund volume of all investors in Germany. And as long as that's the case, you can't expect as dedicated and as sophisticated analysts and investor base in Germany as in, but that is also congruent with the lack of depth and breadth of equity markets in Germany. So that is certainly something that takes a long time, and Germany alone won't fix the problem. You need, of course, the European scale to address that and to become competitive there.
So you need to get all the pensions in a room and say, take a little more risk? Is that the solution
Well,
here?
it's not only a question, nudging is certainly an important element of that, but we also have to set the institutional prerogatives to allow that to happen. So we need to increase the incentives for 401k type of pension plans in Germany. And that's part of the coalition agreement of the new government, that both in the corporate pensions pillar and the private pensions pillar, there will be strong tax incentives and incentives to build up those equity-based retirement plans. But I'm not under any naive illusion that this will not be something that you make a reform and it'll be fixed. I mean, this accumulation of funds takes quite a long time, but we have to start setting the impulse and make it known to the world that this is something that is now happening.
Well, we will have you back next year. We'll check in, see how it's going. Thank you so much for joining us.
Very good. Many thanks.
Please welcome Dr. Sebastian Gorka, Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Counterterrorism at the White House National Security Council, and Shelby Talcott, White House Correspondent at Semafor.
Okay, joining me now is Dr. Sebastian Gorka. Dr. Gorka has been a longtime advisor